Welcome to the weekly duck migration forecast for the 21st through 27th of December. Hope everybody has a great holiday season and that the ducks came in a bit last week. It looked like things should be cooling down weather-wise and heating up duck hunting-wise. I got a good question this week. Um, James from Mississippi asks, it appears there are less ducks, specifically mallards, that show up in Mississippi compared to when I started hunting, and they also show up later in the season. But does that affect how much people go duck hunting? Or I guess what he's asking, are we hunting less now than years ago? I don't really know when you started hunting, but I'm going to guess you've been in this for a little while, enough to see maybe a shift in mallard migration to southern latitudes, which we've seen. But this is a really good question, and actually something in our research lab that I'm going to have a doctoral student, a PhD student, working on relatively soon. But I did a little bit of investigating of this for the North American Duck Symposium a few years back. Yeah, there is a conference specifically focused just on ducks. It's a fantastic conference full of passionate scientists and waterfowl hunters and waterfowl biologists from throughout federal, state agencies, as well as academia, and then like folks from Ducks Unlimited and Delta Waterfowl as well. So I worked up some data on this question a few years ago. And here's one of the slides. I looked at how harvest of mallards was affected by that mallard weather severity index. And I just looked at harvest of, if this is going to manifest itself, it's going to happen at southern latitudes first. So Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, which are about 20% of all the waterfowl hunters in the Mississippi Flyway. So it's not inconsequential. And what I did find is that as more of that area is greater than that mallard threshold, or where we think that mallards should be declining, more area in the Mississippi Flyway is greater than that threshold, mallard harvest goes up in these three states. Now, there's a lot of variation around that. You can see, right, as the area of the beyond the threshold increases, the mallard harvest increases, but the dots aren't really near that line. So there's still a lot of variation around this, and this is what we'd expect, because it's more than just weather that influences the movement of these birds. And that R-square value just means we're explaining about 30% of the variability in the data with just the weather severity index, which actually I think is fairly reasonable. Now, how does that affect days of duck hunting afield in these locations? There is a relationship. It's significant. So the mallard WSI affects the days duck hunting by within this location, the mean number of days duck hunting. But that relationship isn't as good. But if we look at this, we can kind of put this stuff into three boxes, tidy boxes, right? It looks like in that rose-colored that when the mallard WSI isn't that great, and there's a lot of area for mallards to stay north, there's periods when people still go out, 8 to 9 times per year. But then we see if we're going to get really low days afield, it's going to be when that mallard WSI is not strong enough to cause them really to migrate. But what we see in the green box is that days afield are consistently greater on high WSI years, or years where more area to the north is beyond that threshold, and we would expect those mallards to be to the south. So what does that mean? On average, if we just fit that line to it, it's about 1.6 days less from the most mild years compared to the most severe weather years. So this is where I'm interested, is economic impact. This goes beyond James's question. If we figure 1.6 days less times the numbers of hunters times, let's say they spend $50 per trip on gas, stopping at a convenience store, breakfast, all those kinds of things that infuse money into those rural economies at southern latitude. That ends up as a potential on these really mild years to be a potential economic loss of $7.56 million. Doesn't sound like a lot, but to some of these rural businesses, it definitely could have some potential impact. So this is some of the stuff we're going to be looking at, is like, what is the economic impact? And then what is the economic impact on conservation as well? Do we actually have less hunters? It looks like people certainly might go less on some years when the weather is really mild. What we don't know is why on some years they're still going 8 to 9 days, and then other years they're only going maybe 6 to 7 days. So things we'll dig into further with our investigation. But that gives a little feel for how hunter participation kind of follows with this mallard weather severity index. So thanks for your question, James. Good stuff. So we'll jump into this week's forecast. I've been showing you the snow lately. 2020 has been a lot lower snow than 2019. The Atlantic coast got a really good shot last week that would have, pushed a lot of birds into mid-latitude locations just south of that snow line into the Chesapeake Bay. That's where there's a lot of water right now as well. But if you look, the kind of upper Midwest and the prairies, doesn't really have any snowpack. They're getting cold, but they don't have snow. I think a little bit of snow will be coming this week, but they're cold enough to mostly be frozen out at this point in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, the Dakotas, down to sections of Iowa. Iowa's losing ducks really quick. Not quite completely froze out yet, though. So the summary is good again this week. Cold and snow continues into the coming week. It's good news for duck hunters. I definitely think the timing is right. Folks are on, Christmas vacation and should have some time to get out. At the latitude of Iowa, duck abundance really continues to decrease substantially, and it's really mostly only mallards remaining. Mallard and black duck migration is expected Thursday and Friday in the Mississippi Flyway and Friday to Sunday in the Atlantic Flyway. We're going to warm up a little bit here. Maybe even get some shots of rain. Again, it's going to melt some snow, but then Thursday and Friday in the Mississippi Flyway, and then that cold moves Friday to Sunday into the Atlantic Flyway, and probably going to be sustained for a while. So I think we're looking at some good movements here. So continued migration of dabbling ducks this week, predicted with strong movements on those same days as above for things like pintails and gadwall and widgeon and green wings, some stronger than others, and I'll show those in the charts in a second here. In the mid-Atlantic coast is extremely wet right now, so that could delay migration of ducks to locations farther south. So even though that WSI threshold is great enough to cause some movement of these birds, things other than mallards, basically, and black ducks, all that water is providing a lot of foraging opportunity and maybe new opportunities. So that might really delay some of those birds to locations further south. So if you don't see as strong of a movement in the southern reaches of the Atlantic Flyway, that flood water that's just north of you may be holding some birds. So this is what we like to see for mallards and black ducks at this time of year. Things are lighting up blue. In the Mississippi Flyway, well, we could argue that Ohio might even be considered a split between the Mississippi and Atlantic. They get birds kind of from both locales. But you start to see blue for the first time at the mid-latitude of Ohio. Des Moines, Iowa, again, that Iowa latitude has lost a lot of mallards already. So those blues will continue to kick some birds out of those latitudes. I think by next week I'm going to put the North Dakotas froze out even for mallards and black ducks. They're pretty much done at this point. I was just going to give it one more week, but it looks like they're going to enter a deep freeze, just like Ontario. Ottawa in the Atlantic Flyway has kind of hit a pretty deep freeze. New York's marshes last week, all the shallow stuff froze. Finger Lakes and the Great Lakes and some of the larger lakes still have birds, but a lot of those birds are moving out. Black duck band recoveries are starting to show up on Long Island from birds that we've banded on Long Island the last few years. So those birds a week ago were New Brunswick and Quebec and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island is where they were getting shot, and now they're starting to show up on Long Island. So that's kind of where mallards, black ducks are. Coastal Pennsylvania, they're starting to pick up pretty good, and then hopefully moving down into the mid-Atlantic region at this point. I wouldn't put mallards much further south than reaches of North Carolina at best, but most of them are probably between New York and North Carolina at this point. Missouri continues to have a ton of birds in the as usual in the Mississippi Flyway, and specifically holding good numbers of mallards still at this point. Again, if we look at these Thursday, Friday, that 10 and that 9, that's that cold front from Iowa moving over to Ohio. And then that 686 in Syracuse is that Friday to Sunday cold front that crosses the Atlantic Flyway. Pintails, similar stuff, right? They're continuing to move pretty strong, more strongly in the Mississippi Flyway, I would say, and starting to bump down into Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama for those folks. And I'd even only just put it at a trickle still, and into places as far south as South Carolina. North Carolina right now should be really, in Maryland, should be really piled up with pintails for the most part. Gadwall, if we look at these WSI values, other than out towards Columbus, Ohio, as soon as we get towards DC and North Carolina, DC is cold enough to move them. North Carolina, it's just below that threshold, so anybody south of North Carolina, I'd expect a trickle of these birds in. But mid latitudes, I think, are going to be really solid with Gadwall, and maybe as far south as North Carolina. Shovelers on the move. A lot of these birds now, start to get a shoveler, widgeon, and green-winged teal. The bulk of them should be starting to approach their southern wintering areas for the most part at this point. So you should be able to get into those birds fairly well if you focus on them. A couple we go after a little bit more, widgeon and green-winged teal. They're still hanging pretty heavy in the Missouri latitude, kind of mid-latitude-ish, but they're also, bumping down to more southern latitudes and should provide good opportunity this week. Again, Thursday, Friday in the Mississippi Flyway, and then Friday to Sunday in the Atlantic Flyway for good movements of these birds. Here's river gauges comparing this week to last week. Again, the mid-Atlantic coast, when all that snow came through, there was rain underneath it and got hit real heavy with rain. And now we're getting a melt. And so these, everywhere that got that heavy snow is going to see a really substantial melt. For places in Pennsylvania that are in drought conditions, that should really help. As far north, we are in the Syracuse end of things, and we only got maybe about 6 inches at most, but you go a little further south and there was 40 inches of snow on the New York-Pennsylvania border. And I know a lot of folks got buried. So as that melts with this little warm up, that's going to infuse water into those rivers. And we got to be careful because that's good for providing habitat for ducks. But sometimes it can really hold up migration, especially for folks down in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, where some of these birds might not quite be, making it there. Mississippi Flyway still looks, relatively dry, unfortunately. So not in no way in a flood condition state for most folks. That sometimes is good because it forces birds to be in specific areas where you might be hunting. But also, if there's just not water, lots of times birds just boogie right to the coast and be in extreme coastal regions too. And sometimes not stop in between just because of lack of habitat. So we really do need a little bit of a infusion of water in some places and a little less in others for the most part. All right, thanks, folks. Email me your questions. Remember, I like these questions. I love answering them. I hope you enjoyed this week's forecast. It's a good one, I think. So keep the subscriptions to the YouTube channel are jumping. That helps me maintain momentum on this project. And I'm going to be keeping these forecasts up until the end of January. So everybody have a great Christmas, great holiday season, and be safe out there and shoot straight. See you next week.